The first light of dawn always arrived quietly, slipping between the rooftops like a shy visitor who did not wish to disturb anyone. Before the streets filled with footsteps and voices, before doors began creaking open, before the markets stirred awake, the very first sign of life each day came from the scent of bread drifting through the air. It floated softly across the narrow lanes of the old industrial city, warming the cool morning breeze with a gentle invitation. For many families, that warm, earthy fragrance was far more reliable than any clock. It signaled that the bakers were awake, the ovens were glowing, and another day was beginning. Inside the small bakeries, where the walls were stained with years of flour and steam, workers moved with a slow, steady rhythm. Their motions were quiet and practiced, shaped by long experience. Wooden paddles slid effortlessly into the oven. Dough, prepared the night before, rose in gentle mounds, ready to become the loaves that would feed an entire neighborhood. The crackle of fire, the soft thump of kneading, and the low murmur of early conversation filled the space with a peaceful kind of industry, not rushed, not frantic, simply steady. The bakers didn't need to rush. The bread would announce itself soon enough. As the smell reached each home, families began to wake. Many houses were small and modest, pressed close together like books on a shelf. Inside, the floors were made of old wooden boards that creaked softly under the weight of sleepy feet. Windows let in a pale morning glow, and blankets still held the night's coolness. Children often woke before they meant to, not because of noise, but because the scent of baking bread carried a comfort that wrapped around them like a warm whisper. It reminded them that even if yesterday had been difficult, today held something familiar. Parents rose with a little more heaviness, their movements slower, but the smell still softened their mornings. Even when worries lingered, worries about work, money, and stretching food long enough, the bread reminded them of something dependable. They would light a small lamp, wash their faces with cold water from a basin, and begin preparing for the day. The routine had a gentle rhythm that made the morning feel safe. In many homes, someone would go outside to fetch a loaf while it was still warm enough to steam in the cool air. The bakery door often opened before the sun fully rose. People lined up quietly, wrapped in coats, scarves, and shawls. Conversations were soft, friendly, and unhurried. There was something calming about waiting together in that quiet moment before the city fully awakened. The air smelled of flour, yeast, and smoke from glowing ovens. When a loaf was handed over the counter, still warm to the touch, people held it carefully, almost protectively. A warm loaf was more than food. It was reassurance in physical form. Back at home, the loaf would be placed gently on the table. Parents cut it with slow, thoughtful slices, making sure each one was even. Some families paired it with a bit of butter if they were lucky, or dipped slices into warm tea to soften them. Others ate it plain, letting the simple taste bring a peaceful start to the morning. The crust cracked softly under their teeth, and the inside melted into something soft and comforting. Even the sound of bread being sliced had a calming familiarity. Children especially looked forward to this moment. The first bite always felt like a reward for waking early, a small joy before the day's chores or school lessons. Some liked the crust, others the softer center, but every piece felt like a treat. At the same time, everyone understood the value of each slice. Families made sure not to waste even the smallest crumb, brushing them into small bowls to save for later soups or stews. Nothing was ever thrown away, but this carefulness never made breakfast feel gloomy. Instead, it made every bite feel meaningful. The quiet morning meal often included soft conversations, parents reminding children about the day ahead, or children asking gentle questions about the world beyond their street. Sometimes there were long stretches of silence, the comfortable kind that happens when everyone is simply enjoying the warmth of the moment. The smell of bread lingered around them, wrapping the room in a gentle coziness that made even small homes feel full. As breakfast came to an end, and as the loaf slowly grew smaller with each passing day, the memory of the morning smell stayed with everyone. It followed them as they stepped outside, as they walked to work or school, as they moved through the noise and business of the growing industrial city. The bread was more than a meal. It was a daily reminder of stability, warmth, and the soft promise that even in a crowded, changing world, some things remained comfortingly constant. The hearth was always the quiet heart of every home, a place where flames glowed softly and shadows danced across the walls. Even in the smallest, most crowded houses, the hearth carried a gentle presence that made the whole space feel warmer. And sitting nearby, usually in a simple wooden basket or an old cloth bag, were the potatoes, humble, dusty, and patient. They waited silently, knowing they would soon be turned into the meal that so many families depended on. In these growing industrial streets, potatoes were more than just food. They were steady companions, always available when nothing else could be found. Families kept them in cool corners to make sure they lasted as long as possible. Some potatoes were round and smooth, while others had little bumps and marks from the soil, reminders that they had come from the earth with very little fuss. They didn't need special care or fancy flavors. They asked for nothing but a warm fire and a bit of time. When the day settled and evening began to fall, families gathered around the hearth to prepare dinner. The sound of peeling potatoes became a familiar part of the night. The knife made soft, steady scratches, the peel falling in long curling ribbons that landed in a small pile on the table. Mothers, fathers, older children, whoever had the energy, took turns peeling, chatting quietly about the day as they worked. There was something peaceful about the rhythm, something grounding in the simple act of preparing food together. Once peeled, the potatoes were dropped into a pot of water, where they rested like small white moons beneath the surface. The pot was then placed over the fire, and soon tiny bubbles began to appear. A faint, comforting aroma rose from the pot, a mild, earthy scent that felt like home. In many households, the potatoes were the only warm part of the meal. But even so, the anticipation around the hearth was gentle and full of appreciation. Some nights, potatoes were boiled until they softened enough to break apart with a fork. Other nights, they were mashed into a smooth, warm mixture that filled bowls with a simple, soothing heaviness. When there was leftover broth or a bit of butter, the meal felt just a little more special. But even without these small extras, potatoes carried a quiet strength that reassured everyone who ate them. Their warmth spread through tired bodies, offering comfort that was calm and steady. Children especially looked to the potatoes with eager eyes. They knew the meal would be plain, but they also knew it would be filling. For many of them, the sight of a steaming bowl placed gently in front of them was enough to end the day on a peaceful note. They would hold their spoons carefully, blowing on the steam, watching it drift upward in soft curls that disappeared into the dim glow of the room. That small moment, waiting for the first warm bite, felt like a tiny ceremony, one that belonged uniquely to the quiet evenings of their homes. Parents watched their children eat with a sense of relief. No matter how difficult the day had been, no matter what challenges tomorrow might bring, the simple meal offered a brief moment of calm. It was not luxurious, but it was dependable, and that dependability meant more than most people realized. As the children ate, conversations softened, turning into small stories about the day, or gentle reminders about chores, or simply shared observations about the firelight. Sometimes, when the fire burned lower, someone would shift a few potatoes into the warm ash to roast them slowly. These roasted potatoes became a quiet treat, soft on the inside, crisp on the outside, with a smoky fragrance that filled the room. Families gathered around the hearth, waiting patiently for them to be ready. The first bite always brought a small spark of joy, the kind that didn't need loud celebration. Just a soft smile, a satisfied sigh, a moment of stillness. The hearth itself played a soothing role in these evenings. The crackling of the fire, the glowing embers, the warmth that spread through the room, it all worked together to create a space that felt safe, even when storms rumbled outside or when worries filled the air. Potatoes simmering in their pot made the home smell comforting, as though the walls themselves were exhaling a soft, peaceful breath. By the time the meal was finished, the pot was nearly empty, and the hearth was glowing gently. Bowls were cleaned carefully, leftovers saved with thoughtfulness, and the potato peels were set aside to be used in soups or gardens, or anything that might help stretch the food just a little further. Nothing was wasted, not even the smallest scrap. Families moved through these tasks with quiet understanding, making sure the home stayed warm and steady. The simple act of sharing potatoes around the hearth brought everyone closer, creating a sense of togetherness that didn't depend on wealth or abundance. It came instead from the glow of the fire, the steadiness of familiar food, and the knowledge that even small meals could hold deep comfort when shared with care. These moments, ordinary, quiet, and full of warmth, anchored the evenings in a gentle stillness that lingered long after the fire softened into embers. In many homes across the old industrial city, the evening meal was not just food. It was a quiet strategy, a thoughtful plan, something that needed to stretch itself across days. Kitchens were small, shelves were often sparse, and families learned early how to make a single pot of food carry them through almost half a week. It wasn't done with frustration, but with patient care, as though every ingredient held a story worth honoring. The air inside these homes often carried the gentle scent of simmering vegetables, soft spices, or broth that had been reheated again and again, each day deepening its flavor. The pot at the center of the kitchen was more than a cooking tool. It was the heart of the home, the keeper of every meal that would come that week. Some families had pots so old their handles had smoothed from decades of use. Others used whatever tin or iron they could find. But no matter the shape or size, the pot became a symbol of careful planning. Each time something was added, an onion, a bone, a handful of herbs, it was done thoughtfully. Every small choice mattered. Most meals began on a Monday, when families hoped to gather enough ingredients for a hearty base. A few chopped vegetables went in first, followed by whatever meat scraps could be afforded. Potatoes or beans helped fill the pot, making the stew thicker and more sustaining. Children watched with quiet fascination as the pot slowly filled, the water turning from clear to golden or brown as flavors mingled. There was a comforting rhythm to it, washing, chopping, stirring, waiting. The kitchen filled gradually with warmth, and even before the first spoonful was tasted, everyone felt calmer knowing the pot was full. When the stew was ready, bowls were served with soft gratitude. The first night always felt a bit special because the meal tasted its freshest. Spoons clinked gently against bowls as everyone took slow, steady bites, savoring the warmth that spread through their bodies. Conversations floated around the table in soft tones, children describing a moment from school, parents sharing something from work, or someone remarking on the weather. Even if the day had been tiring, the quiet closeness around the table brought a sense of peace. After dinner, the pot was not emptied. Instead, the remains were stirred together, covered with a cloth or a lid, and placed carefully near the hearth where it would stay warm enough to avoid spoiling. The leftovers rested overnight, the flavors settling deeper into the vegetables and broth. Families trusted the pot to keep giving. They relied on its ability to stretch itself thin without losing comfort. On the second day, the stew was reheated. The bubbling sound in the pot filled the kitchen with a peaceful familiarity. Anyone listening would have recognized that soft murmur, the quiet promise that there would be enough for another evening meal. Sometimes, a little water was added to the pot to make the stew last longer. Other times, a scrap of bread from the previous day was broken into pieces and stirred in, thickening the broth. No one minded these changes. The taste grew richer with each passing day, as though the stew was remembering every moment it had simmered. By the third day, the meal had transformed. It was thinner, gentler, and softer in flavor, but it still carried the warmth of home. Parents watched carefully to make sure each child had enough to feel full, even if the bowls looked a bit smaller. Children understood without being told. They learned early that food needed to last. Yet the atmosphere never felt gloomy. The simplicity of the meal brought a kind of calm acceptance that wrapped around the family like a comfortable blanket. In many households, the quiet talk after dinner was dedicated to planning how long the pot could stretch. Parents whispered softly, not wanting the children to worry, discussing whether the stew would last one more night, or if they needed to find something small to add. These conversations were gentle, thoughtful, shaped by love more than fear. They spoke of ways to manage, ways to make the week smoother, ways to protect the warmth of the home. When the pot finally reached its last portion, usually by the fourth night, everyone treated the final bowl with respect. The last ladleful was always served carefully, making sure no one missed out on a small piece of carrot or potato resting at the bottom. Sometimes, the pot would be refilled the next morning, beginning the cycle again. Other times, families waited, hoping the next market day would bring enough ingredients to start anew. Each week, the meal meant to last taught everyone quiet resilience. It taught them to appreciate simple flavors, to find comfort in routine, and to share what little they had with patience and kindness. The pot never promised abundance, but it promised consistency And in a world full of noise and uncertainty, that consistency became a gentle anchor. Families ended each evening not feeling deprived, but feeling held together by something warm, steady, and familiar, a humble meal that carried them through the week with quiet strength. The market awakened long before the sun climbed fully into the sky. It began quietly, with only a few footsteps echoing down the narrow, cobbled streets. The soft rumble of cart wheels and the low murmur of early vendors hinted at what was about to unfold. But by the time the first beam of sunlight stretched across the rooftops, the market had come alive in full, vibrant motion. It was as if the city itself inhaled deeply and exhaled a wild, bustling melody that poured into every corner. The sound of sellers calling out their prices rose above everything else. Their voices carried warmth and energy, shaped by years of practice. Some called in deep, steady tones, while others used bright, cheerful shouts that felt almost musical. Together, they created a rhythm that blended into a lively chorus, one that echoed through the air and wove itself into the daily life of the people. The market never needed instruments or singers. Its music was made from human voices, clattering baskets, and the steady beat of many footsteps moving across stone stalled the streets like a colourful patchwork. Each one had its own personality. Some were covered in cloth awnings of faded blues and reds, fluttering gently whenever a breeze passed. Others had wooden roofs built by hand, patched together with nails that had rusted from years of rain. Tables overflowed with goods, potatoes dusty from the earth, carrots bundled neatly with twine, onions piled high in golden nets, and meats arranged carefully on wooden boards. Despite the simplicity, everything felt vibrant, as if the market breathed a kind of life that didn't exist anywhere else. Children walked through the market with wide, curious eyes. They held on tightly to their parents' hands, breathing in the mix of scents, fresh vegetables, warm bread from distant stalls, and spices that brought a hint of faraway places. Sometimes they stopped to look at baskets filled with apples, admiring their soft shine, or stared at hanging herbs tied in bunches that swayed gently in the air. Even if they couldn't buy everything they saw, the sight alone filled their minds with a sense of wonder. Sellers, despite their loud voices, moved with kindness. Many greeted families by name, remembering them from the week before. They greeted children with gentle smiles, offering a small slice of carrot or a tiny bit of bread just for tasting. These small gestures added warmth to the market's loud atmosphere. In the middle of all the noise and movement, people still found moments of simple friendliness. Quiet exchanges that softened the edges of the day. The busiest part of the market often came mid-morning, when the sunlight made the vegetables shine and the air felt warm enough for cheerful energy. People squeezed through narrow paths between stalls, some carrying baskets woven from willow branches, others holding old cloth bags worn thin from years of use. Bargaining filled the air in its own special tone, voices rising and falling softly, not with anger, but with the gentle persistence of people trying their best to make every coin count. The conversations were lively but respectful, as if everyone understood the shared struggle behind each exchange. The market was not only a place for food, but also a place for stories. As families moved from stall to stall, they paused to talk with neighbours, sharing small moments from their week. Some spoke about weather that had changed too quickly. others about work that had grown harder, and some simply described something funny their child had said the night before. These conversations blended themselves into the market's constant song. The words, laughter, and sighs all became part of the atmosphere, rising gently like smoke from the cooking stalls. From time to time, a gentle hush swept through the crowd, not silence, but a softer rhythm. This happened when a baker carried out fresh bread, or when a farmer arrived with a newly harvested basket of vegetables. People paused for a moment, leaning forward with curiosity, watching the goods being set down. The excitement was always calm, wrapped in polite patience. These moments brought a quiet anticipation that felt almost like the pause between musical notes. For families who couldn't buy much, walking through the market still held a certain comfort. Seeing the abundance gathered together reminded them that life, even in difficult times, continued to offer color and variety. The sights and sounds wrapped around them like a familiar blanket. The market might have been noisy, but it carried a warmth that softened the noise into something almost soothing. By late afternoon, when the sun began drifting toward the horizon, the market's song softened. Vendors lowered their voices, the crowds thinned, and the stalls slowly emptied. The echo of the day lingered in the air, the shouts, the footsteps, the bargaining, the laughter. As the last carts rolled away, the streets felt quieter, holding the peaceful aftersound of a day well lived. The market's wild song was never the same from one day to the next. Yet it always brought a feeling of liveliness and connection that stayed with people long after they left. It was a place where the city's heartbeat could be heard clearly, full of motion, voices, and gentle human warmth. There were days when the usual routines of life, stretching meals, counting coins carefully, and making do with what little sat on the shelves, felt a little lighter. These days did not arrive often, nor did they need to. They came quietly, almost shyly, like a soft breeze drifting through an open window. On such days, a family might discover that a few extra coins had been saved, or that a neighbour had shared something small, or that a vendor at the market offered a price just gentle enough to manage. These small shifts opened the door for something rare, a meal that felt like a tiny celebration. The moment began long before dinner was ready. It started with the discovery itself. A handful of carrots at a good price, a small piece of meat, or a few sweet apples resting in a woven basket at the market. Parents would pause when they found these things, holding them with quiet appreciation. There was no rush, no loud excitement, just a peaceful gratitude. They imagined the warmth these ingredients would bring to their home, and the thought alone softened the weight of the day. Back home, the kitchen seemed brighter on such evenings. The familiar pot, usually filled with simple vegetables or broth stretched thin, now welcomed something a little richer. The small piece of meat released a comforting aroma as it cooked, filling the space with a scent that made everyone straighten with curiosity. Children peeked around doorways, catching hints of spices or sweetness they didn't smell every day. Even the sound of chopping and stirring felt different, still slow and steady, but carrying a quiet joy beneath each movement. As the meal simmered, the air in the home grew warm with anticipation. The steam rising from the pot curled like soft ribbons, carrying a gentle promise to every corner of the room. Some nights, there was a loaf of bread to accompany it. Other nights, A handful of herbs added color and fragrance. These little additions turned ordinary ingredients into something that felt almost festive. No one needed to say it out loud, but everyone knew the meal would be special. When the moment finally came to gather at the table, the family did so with a calm kind of excitement. Bowls were placed carefully, spoons set gently, and for a few quiet seconds, the room held a soft hush. Then the pot was opened, and the aroma that escaped felt like a warm embrace. The meal was served thoughtfully, with each person receiving a portion that felt generous compared to most nights. Children leaned forward with bright eyes, their hearts filled with gratitude that didn't need words. The first taste always brought a small pause. It was not dramatic, not loud. Just a moment where everything seemed to settle into stillness. The warmth of the food spread through the body, comforting the chest, easing the shoulders, and softening the expressions of even the most tired faces. Parents exchanged quiet glances, filled with relief and gentle pride. They had done the best they could, and on this night, the best had become something tender and hopeful. As the meal continued, the conversation grew warmer. Children spoke with more energy, sharing small stories or dreams that had been waiting inside them. Parents listened, smiling softly, allowing themselves to enjoy the ease of the moment. Laughter bubbled up now, and then, not loud or boisterous, but gentle, like the sound of a soft stream moving over smooth stones. Even the clinking of spoons against bowls felt harmonious. These meals did not erase the challenges of daily life, but they shone like lanterns in the long hallway of the week, brief, glowing, soothing. They reminded everyone that joy didn't always need grand occasions. It could arrive in the form of a tender bite of meat, or the sweetness of an apple, or a slightly fuller bowl that made a child feel warm and cared for. Hope didn't demand much. It grew quietly in the presence of small comforts. After dinner, the feeling lingered. Bowls were washed gently, and the kitchen carried the soft scent of the meal, long after the pot had cooled. Children often went to bed with fuller stomachs and softer hearts, drifting into sleep with a sense of safety. Parents sat for a moment longer at the table, breathing in the silence, allowing themselves to feel grateful. They knew these evenings were rare, but they also knew they were precious. Little reminders that life had its own way of offering sweetness when it could. The taste of hope was never loud or overwhelming. It was delicate, warm, and quietly steady. It came from simple food shared with care, from the gentle surprise of having just enough to enjoy something special, and from the peaceful moments that followed. In a world that often demanded strength, these meals offered softness. They were reminders that even in the hardest seasons, life sometimes set a small, comforting feast upon the table, a feast made not of luxury, but of togetherness, warmth, and the quiet promise that better days could still bloom in their own time. As the years passed, the city expanded in every direction. New buildings rose from the ground like determined giants, their tall shapes stretching toward the sky. Chimneys appeared one after another, releasing steady streams of smoke that drifted above the rooftops in quiet grey ribbons. Streets that were once open and empty began to fill with wagons, workers, and families arriving from far-off villages. The city hummed with movement, the kind that never truly paused. Even in the quietest hours, distant footsteps or the faint echo of machinery could be heard, reminding everyone that the city was always awake. With this growth came opportunity, but opportunity did not always arrive with comfort. People came seeking work, hoping for steady wages and fuller meals, yet the city's rhythm moved faster than they expected. Factories hired many, but wages remained small, and the cost of living began to rise like the new buildings themselves. Food, once easy to find in the quieter countryside, became harder to afford within the crowded streets. Hunger settled into the city not with noise or drama, but with a slow, quiet persistence, like a shadow that stretched a little farther each day. Families noticed it first at their tables. Meals that once filled bowls now seemed to shrink, and ingredients that used to be inexpensive started to slip out of reach. Bread cost a bit more, vegetables were sold in smaller bundles, and meat, already rare, felt more like a dream than something that could be served at supper. Parents counted their coins with extra care, turning them over in their hands as if hoping one might multiply. They planned meals even more carefully, trying to stretch food not just across days, but sometimes across entire weeks. The markets, once lively with abundance, now felt different. Vendors still called out prices, and stalls still overflowed with colour and noise, but behind the cheerful displays was a quiet strain. Farmers spoke gently about poor harvests. Sellers apologized softly when they raised prices, their voices carrying a hint of worry. The joyful bustle of the market remained, but hidden beneath it was a shared understanding. Everyone was trying their best in a world that had grown heavier. Crowds in the market grew thicker as more families arrived in the city. Some moved slowly from stall to stall, comparing prices, hoping to find something more affordable. Others walked with careful steps, carrying only a few coins in their pockets, choosing each item with great thought. Children watched with wide, observant eyes, sensing the shift, even if they didn't fully understand it. They held tightly to their parents' hands, listening to the soft exchanges, the quiet sighs, and the gentle bargaining that shaped the day's purchases. Hunger was not loud, but it was present. In the thinner slices of bread, in the smaller portions on plates, in the quiet ways families learned to manage. Yet even in this growing difficulty, there was a softness in how people treated one another. Neighbours shared when they could, offering half a loaf or a handful of potatoes when they sensed a need. Vendors sometimes slipped an extra onion into a basket or let a few coins slide, pretending not to notice the difference. These gestures were small, but they carried great warmth. In a city that was rapidly changing, kindness remained a steady comfort. Homes adapted too. Kitchens became places of thoughtful invention, where parents used whatever they had to make meals feel nourishing. Broths were stretched with extra water, breadcrumbs were saved to thicken soups, and vegetables were cooked until every bit of flavour was drawn out. The hearth glowed gently each evening, offering warmth even when the meals simmering above it were simple. Families gathered close, sharing not just food, but stories, reassurances, and the quiet comfort of being together. The city itself seemed to reflect these challenges. Streets became busier, factories louder, and days longer, but within the noise, people carried a resilient calm. They learned to walk with steady hope, believing that their efforts would eventually bring easier days. Children grew wiser, understanding the value of each meal and appreciating even the simplest portions placed before them. Parents grew stronger in their quiet determination, finding courage in the small victories of making each day work. even as the hunger grew. The city's heart beat with a gentle rhythm of persistence. People woke each morning, ready to try again. They worked hard, shared what they could, and found comfort in small joys, in the warmth of the hearth, in the laughter of a child, or in the soft glow of evening light settling across the rooftops. Life was not easy, but it continued with a quiet grace that softened the edges of hardship. The growing city brought challenges, but it also brought a sense of togetherness. In the crowded streets and humble homes, people discovered that resilience did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered, steady and calm, guiding families through each day with a quiet strength that could not be easily shaken. Night settled gently over the old industrial city, folding its arms around the rooftops, chimneys, and narrow lanes as though trying to hush the noise that had ruled the daylight hours. The sky, dim and softly smudged with the glow of distant factories, seemed to breathe out a tired sigh. Inside one of the many small brick houses tucked close together like tired neighbours, leaning on each other for warmth, a single candle flickered to life. Its flame, thin and delicate, painted a soft gold across the room and swayed as if greeting everything it touched. The house was quiet now. The clatter of pots had faded. The boots by the door rested without complaint, and even the wooden chairs looked relieved to be left alone. After a long day of work, errands, and holding life together in the best way possible, quietness felt like a small gift, fragile but cherished. A family sat around the little table where the candle burned. The light made their shadows stretch long and gentle across the floor. Some had their hands wrapped around warm cups, others rested their elbows on the table, simply enjoying the rare calm. The city outside might have been restless, but here, for a short hour, the world seemed to loosen its grip. The youngest child leaned forward, watching the candle as though it held magic secrets. There was something comforting in the tiny flame, a reminder that even the smallest glow could push away a roomful of darkness. To the child, the candle felt like a friend, steady, patient, never too bright, never too loud. It was just enough. The mother smiled, seeing how mesmerized the little one was. She reached across the table and gently brushed a crumb from the child's cheek. "Long day?" she asked softly, though she already knew the answer. Every day felt long now, shaped by the push of the growing city, the hum of machines, and the endless search for food that could last until the next morning. But the child nodded anyway, because it felt nice to be asked. A warm, peaceful stillness wrapped around the room, if anyone had listened carefully. They might have heard the faint hum of factory engines far beyond the houses, or the clop of a late horse cart echoing through the streets. But inside, the candle's soft crackle drowned out everything else. It felt like the flame was telling the room to rest. The father sat back in his chair, eyes half closed, letting the warm air from the hearth brush against his face. His bones ached. He would never say it aloud, but the tiredness had begun living in him like an old tenant who refused to leave. Still, moments like this made the strain feel easier. The candlelight reminded him of something gentle, something hopeful, even if he couldn't name it. The older siblings whispered quietly to each other, sharing secret thoughts. Dreams they weren't sure they should speak too loudly. One spoke of wanting to learn a skill beyond the factory floor. Another imagined owning a little shop one day, perhaps selling bread or sewing materials, something simple but steady. Their voices were soft, almost afraid to disturb the calm, but they glowed just as warmly as the candle's light. Even the walls of the small home seemed to listen. They had heard laughter, tired breaths, whispered worries, and quiet prayers. Tonight, they heard something softer, dreams that rose like warm steam from a pot. The candle carried them gently, letting them float around the room without fear. The mother began telling a story, her voice low and rhythmic, the way someone might hum a lullaby without thinking. She spoke about simple things, fields she had known as a child, mornings that smelled of dew and warm earth, evenings where fireflies drifted like wandering stars. The children listened, imagining a world quieter than the one outside their window, a place where the horizon felt wide and generous. As she talked, the candle flickered, bowing and rising again, as if acknowledging every memory. The family felt themselves soften into the warmth of the tale. The city, with all its hunger and noise, felt distant for a while. Little by little, eyelids grew heavy. The youngest leaned against the mother's arm, drifting somewhere between waking and dreaming. The older ones slouched comfortably in their chairs, the exhaustion of the day finally loosening its hands. Even the father let his head tilt slightly, surrendering to the rare stillness. When the story ended, there was no need for words. The room breathed quietly together. The flame, sensing the weight of sleep settling around it, steadied itself, shining calmly, gently, like a guardian keeping watch. Dreams began to form in each tired mind. Some were small, like hoping for a full basket at the next market. Others were bigger, like imagining a life with a little more time, a little more food, a little more peace. None of the dreams felt impossible under the candle's glow. They rose softly, floating through the warm air, carried by the quiet promise of the night. And as the candle burned on, steady, warm, and patient, the family rested in its gentle light, holding on to their dreams with quiet, hopeful hearts.